light flashing before my eyes.
I'm not listening.
Ratchet, I'm dying.
No, you're not.
Oh, fine. You know, you laughed the first time I did that.
Not even a year after the release of Full Frontal Assault came Ratchet and Clank Into the Nexus for the PlayStation 3. To put it into perspective, the last main title on the console was A Crack in Time, which dropped in 2009. So, to say fans were hungry for a real deal is an understatement. During the development of Into the Nexus, it was stated that the team wanted to return to their roots after 2 side games. With a 4-year gap between main titles, I can understand the hesitation when returning to what brought the team into stardom. There is a fine line between creativity and conventionalism that must be accounted for after a hiatus due to consumers' expectations. If you stray from the beaten path too far, you risk a reset of the product's fanbase. But if you instead try to feed their ego, then what discerns this installment from ones of the past? Well, that is when you fall into a creative paradox. With that being said though, I want you to join me on my adventure as I strap back in and revisit the game to answer the most important question of all. Was Ratchet and Clank Into the Nexus good? To properly answer that question, I will be assessing the gameplay, the story, exploration, and its overall replayability, so let's begin. Starting with the guns, yeah, I know you guys like the guns. There is a mix of old and new. The old are the Omni Blaster, Fusion Grenade, Mr. Zircon, and Warmonger amongst the 12 available weapons. Some of the new additions are the Nightmare Box, Temporal Repulsor, and the Vortex Grenade. It is worth noting that Into the Nexus contains 3 fewer weapons than that of Tools of Destruction and A Crack in Time. So for this title, I did find it easier to level the guns up as Insomniac's focus went from marginal gains via leveling up to minor gains via Raritanium and the weapon stat grid. While I do appreciate the attention to detail, stat grids are always problematic to me as some developers go overboard with stat increases. This means that instead of providing the player with 1 node for a decent increase in damage, they rather spread it across 3 nodes for the same increase. Assassin's Creed Valhalla. For some of these weapons, it is not that bad, but for others, it just feels excessive. Luckily, Raritanium becomes easier to acquire the deeper you get into the game, especially when you have maxed out your favorite weapon or 2. One honorable mention here is the Grav Tether. While not usable in combat, this is where the money comes in for Into the Nexus. The Grav Tether allows Ratchet to open up grav streams from one point to the next, which he can then ride to the destination of choice. I will admit, it is pretty cool to ride these streams and hop from one to the next in succession. If there is one thing Insomniac gets right, it's their approach to gadgets, at least in my opinion, so don't come for me. There's also the return of the hover boots and jetpack, but most importantly is a new gadget by the name of the Rift Cracker for Clank. This transports him into the Netherverse, which is contained in a side-scrolling environment. It gives me vid comic vibes from Up Your Arsenal, but executed differently. I found these minigames in the Netherverse to be a nice change of pace, as each one has a little puzzle to solve. Regarding the side content, there's also Planet Thram, where the smuggler and his parrot resides, doing what they do best, extorting poor Ratchet and Clank for cheap labor. Thram serves as a good old throwback to that of Going Commando, where you could farm out crystals and moonstones in exchange for some cold hard bolts. In case this isn't enough, there's also the Destructapalooza, run by Thugs for Less themselves. I mean, come on. Would this be an official Ratchet and Clank title without some type of arena?
Before Destructapalooza, I was CEO of a respectable mutual fund and brokerage firm. Now I prey on the innocent for a living because the economy is in the shit. Destructipalooza, where there are no rules, no regulations, just one basic principle. Try not to get DED. Dead.
Needless to say, from a gadgets and gameplay perspective, Into the Nexus checks all the boxes off of what makes a Ratchet and Clank game, well, their game. Let us now switch over to the story, as this title wraps up the future trilogy. Ratchet and Clank are tasked with transporting a criminal by the name of Vendra Prague to the Vartex Detention Center with the help of Kronk and Zephyr. But due to Vendra being the criminal that she is, and the attack on the ship by her twin brother, Neftin Prague, this whole ordeal does not go as planned. Thugs for Less ends up invading the ship, rigging it with explosives, and killing both Kronk and Zephyr. R.I.P. Meanwhile, Ratchet and Clank are thrown into the abyss, but with some grav leaping and hitchhiking, they eventually end up on a new planet. They explain the bad news to Tywin, want revenge for the fallen Kronk and Zephyr, and then take off to recapture Vendra and Neftin. As the story progresses, we learn more about Vendra and the leader of the Nethers named Mr. I, who goes on to manipulate her into bringing the Nethers into the real world. In return for Vendra's services, Mr. I then banishes her to the Shadow Realm from whence he came. So Ratchet and Clank then cut a deal with Neftin, where they help him steal the Dimensionator to get Vendra back, but in return, they must surrender to the authorities. Mr. I then gets blasted, Vendra and Neftin turn themselves in, and with the now destroyed Dimensionator, Ratchet and Clank return to Towin. Even though Ratchet is done with the Dimensionator, it appears Clank is not. But cue in Ghost, Kronk, and Zephyr, then roll credits, baby, because that is the end of the series on the PlayStation 3, and the next installment doesn't take place until Rift Apart on the PlayStation 5. Story-wise, part of me wants to say it's sufficient, but if I just left it at that, then I would be lying. With a 4-year gap in this series from one main title to the next, Into the Nexus felt more like an appetizer than a whole entree. Yes, the characters are there, and yes, there's a plot with these characters, but there's no real drive behind their actions. Vendra is a brainwashed criminal convinced by the real evil of the game to commit atrocious acts. Due to her killing Kronk and Zephyr, Ratchet and Clank then get involved to stop her, and that's the gist of it. With a shorter run length than most of its predecessors, Into the Nexus, in my opinion, does a poor job in using the best of the series to its advantage. This is not me saying that the game isn't good, but more so that it could have been great. Vendra is no Dr. Nefarious or Chairman Drek, which is fine, but she lacks the added edge needed to make her memorable, as remember, this game concludes the future trilogy. Regarding Into the Nexus in the grand scheme of things, it is a follow-up that plays it safe in every way imaginable, and within that lies its weakness. It does just enough to count as the next installment in the Ratchet and Clank universe, and nothing more. Looking back at Into the Nexus after playing both Tools of Destruction and A Crack in Time less than 2 years ago, just leaves me wanting more from it. But that just goes to show how impactful both TOD and A Crack in Time are to the future trilogy and the series as a whole. So I cannot fault Into the Nexus for its shortcomings. I just wish it had a bit more effort in all departments, considering it is a mainline game.
Now we can talk about your new cut.
50-50 plus benefits.
60-40. The only way you were getting a boat more is over my dead body.
I know where you sleep.
Oh, all right, 50-50.